I built the nursery crib with these two hands the week she was born. I worked 14-hour shifts in a woodshop that smelled like sawdust and diesel, so she could walk into an Ivy League lecture hall without owing a single bank a single dollar. And last night, while a string quartet sawed through some overpriced waltz inside a French countryside manor that costs more per evening than I used to make in a month, I was standing in a gravel parking lot in a rented tuxedo that didn't fit my shoulders, holding a photograph of a dead woman. Through the leaded glass windows, I saw everything I wasn't supposed to see. My own brother, my own sister, cousins who hadn't spoken to me in a decade, all raising champagne flutes under a chandelier I helped pay for without anyone knowing my name. And in the middle of that gold-lit room, the bride of the evening, my daughter, had her arm looped through the arm of a stranger, a billionaire, the groom's father. Walking her down the aisle, I built with money she thinks fell out of the sky. She told every relative in that room that I refused to come out of pure selfishness. She had me erased from the guest list to make room for a crown made of somebody else's money. What she doesn't know, what she's about to learn in the ugliest, most expensive way a person can learn anything, is that the $80,000 check covering that lawn, those lights, and the dress currently wrapped around her lie was still sitting in my banking app, pending. One tap. That's all it took to let the truth do what my voice never could. Before I tell you how a father dismantled his own daughter's fairy tale with nothing but a bank app and a folder of paperwork, hit that like button and subscribe if stories about quiet men and loud consequences speak to you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. Now let's go back to the beginning, to the man I was before that gravel parking lot taught me who my daughter had become. My name is Marcus Colby. I am 68 years old, a retired carpenter, a widower, and until 9 o'clock last night, I believe there wasn't a single thing on this earth I hadn't already sacrificed for my daughter. The drive out to the Hamptons took me 6 hours in a pickup truck that's older than some of the guests at that wedding probably were. I left before the sun came up because a man my age doesn't trust his own reflexes on a highway full of people in a hurry. I didn't mind the drive. I would have driven twice that distance for Grace. I always had. On the passenger seat, wrapped in the same soft blue cloth I'd used for 30 years, sat the one thing in this world I valued more than my own hands. Eleanor's pearl necklace. My wife wore it on our wedding day, wore it every anniversary after, and in the last clear-headed week before the cancer finally decided to stop being patient with her, she made me promise, made me swear on the kitchen table where we'd raised our daughter, that I would put it around Grace's neck myself on her wedding day. Not before, Eleanor had said, gripping my hand harder than I thought she had left in her. Not FedEx, not a card. Your hands, Marcus. She has to feel that it's from both of us. I had spent 3 years waiting to keep that promise. I thought last night would be the night I finally did. I wore the same navy suit I'd worn to bury my wife. It was the only suit I owned that still fit right, and there was something almost fitting about that. The same fabric that had watched me lower Eleanor into the ground was going to watch me hand our daughter the last piece of her mother she had left. The venue was a converted countryside estate that looked like somebody had airlifted a piece of the French wine country into Long Island and then charged people obscene amounts of money to pretend they were somewhere else. Tall iron gates, topiary trimmed into shapes I couldn't begin to name, a security detail standing at a folding table like they were guarding a head of state instead of my daughter's marriage. A young man in an earpiece scanned a tablet twice, then a third time, his mouth tightening a little more with every pass. "I'm sorry, sir. I'm not seeing your name on the list." "There has to be a mistake," I said, and I remember smiling when I said it because some part of me, the part that had spent 32 years believing my daughter loved me the way I loved her, genuinely believed that. "I'm the father of the bride." He didn't even blink. He'd clearly rehearsed this exact sentence for exactly this exact situation. I understand, sir, but this list was finalized and confirmed twice by the family. I don't have any flexibility here. I stood there a moment longer than a man my age should stand anywhere in dress shoes, watching him not look at me, watching a line of guests in gowns that cost more than my truck flow past on either side of me like I was a rock in a river they'd learned to root around. Somewhere behind those iron gates, a string quartet was tuning up. Laughter drifted over the hedges. Champagne corks popped in a rhythm that sounded almost cheerful if you didn't know what it was actually paying for. I didn't argue. I've never been a man who argues with people who are only doing what they've been told to do. I walked the perimeter, instead, along a low stone wall that wrapped around the side of the property, until I found what the wall was clearly built to hide from a public road and reveal to anyone willing to walk far enough. A wall of leaded glass, floor to ceiling, looking straight into the reception hall. And there it was. Everything I hadn't been invited to. My brother Dale, laughing with a glass in his hand. My sister Colleen, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin like she was watching something beautiful instead of something built on a lie. Cousins I hadn't spoken to since Eleanor's funeral, dressed like they'd raided a Vogue photo shoot, toasting to a marriage none of them knew the real price of. And in the center of that gold-lit room, under a chandelier that probably cost more than my house, was my daughter. Grace looked like something out of a painting, a dress so white it seemed to glow, hair swept up the way her mother used to wear hers on special occasions. A smile so radiant I almost forgot, for one full second, why I was standing on the outside of glass instead of the inside of it. Then the music shifted, slower, sweeter, the kind of song that only means one thing at a wedding, the father-daughter dance. I watched my daughter step into the arms of a man in a suit that had clearly been measured onto his body by hand, a tall, silver-haired man with the kind of ease that only comes from never once in his life worrying about a bounced check. Vaughn Sinclair, the groom's father, a man Grace had known for perhaps 18 months, holding my daughter the way I used to hold her when she was 6 years old and couldn't sleep through a thunderstorm. She was crying, real tears streaking down real makeup, her head tilted against his shoulder like he was the safest place in the room. I stood in the dark on the other side of that glass, close enough to count the buttons on his jacket, and I watched my daughter be someone else's little girl in a moment that belonged, by blood, by every promise her mother ever made me swear to keep, to me. I felt something crack behind my ribs that I don't have a clean word for. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't even fully grief yet. It was the specific, silent devastation of watching your entire life's purpose get quietly reassigned to a stranger while a quartet plays something in three-quarter time. I might have stood there until the song ended, might have let myself keep believing there was an explanation, a mix-up, a lost invitation somewhere in a mail carrier's bag, if a waiter hadn't stepped outside for a cigarette 20 feet from where I stood in the dark. He hadn't clocked me as a guest. Nobody in a rented tuxedo standing alone behind a hedge at 10 at night gets clocked as a guest. He clocked me as a driver, waiting on somebody, and men waiting on somebody get talked to like furniture that happens to have ears. Poor bride, he said, exhaling smoke toward the topiary, shaking his head with the kind of performative sympathy people reserve for gossip. They're enjoying a little too much. Heard her real father some drunk who took off with money that wasn't his and couldn't even be bothered to show up to his own daughter's wedding. Family said he refused. Can you imagine? Whole thing paid for by the groom's dad instead. Sad, honestly. He finished his cigarette, ground it under his shoe, and walked back inside to refill a tray of champagne flutes, never once looking at the man he'd just handed a loaded gun to. I want to tell you I felt rage in that moment. I didn't. Rage would have been easier. What I felt was the tears I'd been fighting for the last 20 minutes simply stop, mid-fall, like someone had reached into my chest and turned off a faucet. Whatever had been breaking behind my ribs finished breaking. And on the other side of that break was something colder and steadier than grief has ever let me feel before. I didn't storm the entrance. I didn't demand the microphone. I didn't do a single thing that would have given my daughter the satisfaction of calling me embarrassing in front of people whose approval she'd apparently decided was worth more than her own father's name. I turned around. I walked back along that stone wall, past the topiary, past the security table, where the young man with the tablet didn't even look up this time. And I got into my pickup truck with Eleanor's pearls still wrapped in blue cloth on the passenger seat. I sat there for a long moment before I started the engine, looking at the glow of that chandelier through the trees one last time, thinking about every 14-hour shift, every skipped vacation, every dollar I'd quietly funneled toward a life my daughter was currently telling an entire ballroom I'd refused to be part of. Then I turned the key, and I drove home in a silence so complete it felt like the loudest sound I'd ever heard. What Grace didn't know, what none of them in that glowing room full of borrowed elegance knew, was that the lie the caterer had just handed me for free was about to cost her a great deal more than a wedding. Here is the part of the story Grace never told anyone in that ballroom, because if she had, not one of those glittering relatives would have raised their champagne glass with quite so much enthusiasm. I never abandoned my daughter. I never touched a drop of money that wasn't mine to spend, and I certainly never ran from a single obligation I ever made to her. That story, the drunk, the deadbeat, the man who took off with money that wasn't his, was invented, polished, and distributed by my own daughter, one relative at a time, over roughly 2 years, because the truth was far less useful to her than the lie. The truth is this. 2 years ago, Grace called me, breathless and half-laughing in that way she does when she's nervous and trying not to show it, to tell me she was dating a Sinclair. The Sinclairs, the kind of family whose name shows up on hospital wings and university buildings, the kind of family that gets a wing named after them for donating what most people would call a modest inheritance. She didn't need to say the rest out loud. I heard it anyway, underneath the excitement. The fear that Vaughn Sinclair's son might take one look at where Grace actually came from and decide she wasn't quite polished enough for the family portrait. So my daughter, creative director of a lifestyle magazine that had spent years teaching other people how to perform wealth they didn't have, decided the easiest fix wasn't honesty. It was set design, and I was cast without ever agreeing to the role as her invisible financier. It started small, the way these things always do, a loan for a better apartment in a doorman building near the park, so Bennett would never see the walk-up on the 3rd floor she'd actually been living in since her 20s. I told myself it was reasonable. Every parent wants better for their child. Then came the leased Porsche Cayenne, silver, because apparently a woman engaged to a Sinclair can't be seen valeting a Honda outside a country club. I signed the paperwork myself. I paid every monthly installment from an account Grace didn't know I still quietly funded, because Eleanor's life insurance, invested carefully over the years, had left me far more comfortable than I ever let my own daughter believe. Then came the wedding, $150,000, give or take, moving through a trust account registered under the name Anonymous Family Benefactor, so that not one Sinclair in that ballroom would ever suspect that the caterer, the florist, the string quartet, the ice sculptures, the leaded glass she got married behind, every single detail of the fantasy, had been paid for by a retired carpenter with sawdust permanently ground into the creases of his knuckles. I mortgaged the house Eleanor and I raised her in, the house with her height still marked in pencil on the kitchen doorframe, a line we added every birthday until she turned 18 and decided she was too grown for rulers. I signed those mortgage papers at a kitchen table 2 feet from that doorframe, and I didn't hesitate, because I still believed, foolishly, that a father's silence was a form of love instead of a slow-motion erasure. I did all of it without a single complaint, without a single thank you expected in return, because somewhere in my chest I still believed that if I gave her enough rope, enough runway, enough invisible scaffolding, she would eventually feel secure enough to stop pretending and just be my daughter again in front of these people. I told myself the lie was temporary, a bridge to get her across some insecurity she'd carried since her mother died, after which she'd finally exhale and let the Sinclairs meet the real Colbys. I was wrong. The scaffolding didn't make her secure. It made her comfortable enough to erase me entirely, because the version of her story with a woodshop-owning father who mortgaged his house for her was, apparently, still less flattering than a story where her real father was simply a drunk who couldn't be bothered to show up. 2 years of silent, invisible generosity, and the return on that investment was a security guard with a tablet telling me my own name wasn't on a list I'd financed. I sat in that truck in the venue's overflow parking lot for a long time after the waiter went back inside. Above the tree line, fireworks started cracking open the sky, gold, then blue, then a burst of white that lit the whole gravel lot up like daylight for half a second at a time. My money, my mortgage, my daughter's wedding gift to a family who would never know my name, exploding over my head in colors I'd apparently paid for the privilege of watching from a parking lot 40 yards from the party itself. There's a particular kind of clarity that only shows up after the crying stops. I've heard people describe anger as heat. Mine wasn't heat. It was the opposite, a cold, complete, almost surgical stillness, the kind a man only finds once or twice in a lifetime, usually right after he stops asking a question he's been avoiding for years. What exactly am I still protecting? And who exactly am I protecting it for? I pulled my phone from my jacket pocket and opened my banking app. My hand didn't shake. I want that on the record, because everyone assumes a father's hand should shake in a moment like that. Mine didn't. Eleanor used to say I got steadier, not shakier, the angrier I got. She was right, and I'd forgotten how right until that exact moment. Sitting in the queue, scheduled to auto-draft at 6 the following morning, was the final settlement payment to the venue and catering company, $80,000, the last invoice covering the grounds, the lighting rig, the staff overtime, and I'd bet everything I had left, at least a portion of the dress currently glowing under that chandelier like it had been spun from moonlight instead of my retirement fund. I looked at that number for a long moment. $80,000, the exact amount near enough that would have paid off what remained of my mortgage and let me finally stop lying awake some nights doing math I never let Grace see me do. I hit cancel. A little box appeared the way they always do, asking if I was sure I wanted to cancel this scheduled payment. I have never in my life. I woke up the next morning at 5:40, same as every morning for the last 40 years, and for one merciful, half-conscious second, before memory caught up with consciousness, I forgot entirely that my daughter had gotten married the night before without me in the room. Then it landed, the way it always does, all at once, like a second sunrise I hadn't asked for. I made coffee. Black, same mug Eleanor bought me at a diner in Vermont in 1994. The handle chipped in the same place it's been chipped for a decade, because I've never once let myself throw it away. I put on my work boots. I drove the 15 minutes to my woodshop, the one I technically retired from 2 years ago, but still show up to 3 mornings a week, because an empty house makes a man count his own heartbeat, and I'd rather count sawdust. And I spent the day sanding down a set of oak dining chairs a neighbor had asked me to restore for her granddaughter's christening. I left my phone on the workbench, face down the way I always do when I'm working. Not out of spite, out of habit. But I noticed, the way you notice the absence of a sound you were braced for, that it never once buzzed, not once all day. No missed call from my daughter asking whether her father, the man who had driven 12 hours round trip in a single day at 68 years old, had made it home safely. No text asking if I was all right. No message of any kind from anyone in that entire glowing ballroom. I told myself there was still time. Newlyweds sleep in. Newlyweds are busy with brunches and gift opening and whatever it is people photograph for the internet the morning after a wedding like that. I told myself a great many generous things that Sunday, the way a man does when he isn't ready yet to accept what silence is actually telling him. I even at one point picked up my own phone and stared at Grace's contact photo, a picture from 4 Christmases ago, before the Sinclairs, before the Porsche, before any of it, and put it back down without dialing. Sunday came and went. Still nothing. Not from Grace, not from Dale or Colleen either, which told me the wedding gossip hadn't yet caught up to the venue's accounting department. Monday morning, I went back to the shop. I was halfway through applying a coat of tung oil to the last chair leg when my phone, sitting on the workbench behind me, started buzzing against the wood with enough force to walk itself half an inch to the left. I glanced at it. Grace. I felt something in my chest lift, foolishly, instinctively, the way a father's chest still lifts even after everything, and then it stopped ringing before I could wipe the oil off my hands and cross the shop floor to reach it. By the time I picked it up, there were 3 missed calls. By the time I'd washed the oil off my palms, there were 7. By early afternoon, there were more than a dozen, stacked up like a woodpile nobody had bothered to split, and underneath them, a string of texts that told me everything I needed to know about exactly what my daughter had noticed was missing from her new life. Dad, call me, it's urgent. Dad, my card got declined at the airport. This is so embarrassing. Please call me back. Dad, seriously, what is going on? The hotel is saying we have to pay for last night's room? Dad, the venue is saying the final payment bounced. They're threatening to send it to collections, maybe even call the police. Call me back. I read every single one of them standing at my workbench with a rag still in one hand. And I want you to notice, the way I eventually noticed, what wasn't in a single one of those messages. Not one word about the wedding itself. Not one word asking why I hadn't been there, or how I'd found out, or whether I was even alive after driving 12 hours in a single day. Not one syllable of concern for the man who raised her. Only a woman in a 5-star honeymoon suite, suddenly and violently allergic to the idea of paying for anything herself for the first time in 2 years. That, more than the wedding, more than the glass wall, more than the waiter's cigarette confession, is the moment something in me finally, fully, closed like a shop door at the end of a long shift. I didn't answer the calls. I've never been a man who does his talking on the phone when it matters, and this mattered more than anything I'd said out loud in years. Instead, that evening, after I'd locked up the shop and driven home and eaten dinner alone at a kitchen table built for 4, I sat down and typed exactly one message. I read it 3 times before I sent it, not because I doubted a word of it, but because I wanted to be absolutely certain I meant every syllable, calmly, without a shred of the rage that would have made it easy for her to dismiss me as bitter, instead of simply, finally, done pretending. The wedding of the season was stunning, Grace, truly. I hope the honeymoon is everything you told everyone your father refused to give you. Give my regards to the irresponsible drunk. I hear he's finally decided to stop financing other people's fantasies. I hit send before I could talk myself into softening a single word of it, set the phone on the counter, and went to rinse my dinner plate like I hadn't just detonated something. The response came almost instantly, the 3 little dots appearing and disappearing 4 separate times before an actual message finally landed, which told me more than the message itself did, that my daughter, for the first time since I'd walked away from that glass wall, had absolutely no idea what to say to a father who suddenly knew everything. Dad, what does that mean? What did you hear? Where are you right now? Are you okay? That last question, tacked on almost as an afterthought after 2 lines of pure panic, told me exactly where I still ranked on her list of priorities. I didn't answer any of it. I set the phone face down on the kitchen table, the same table where I'd signed the mortgage papers that paid for her fantasy, and I sat there in the quiet for a long time, listening to the refrigerator hum and the grandfather clock in the hallway mark off another 15 minutes of a life my daughter had spent 2 years pretending didn't exist. Somewhere out there, in a honeymoon suite she could no longer pay for, my daughter was finally putting together exactly how much her father knew, and exactly how much of her fairy tale had been quietly financed by the very man she'd told an entire ballroom she was ashamed of. I didn't need to see her face to know the color it had just drained to. I'd raised her. I knew that face better than she thought I did. The same face she made at 9 years old, standing over a broken vase, calculating whether honesty or denial would cost her less. I didn't sleep much that night, if I'm honest. Not out of guilt. I want to be clear about that because I searched for guilt the way you search a coat pocket for keys you're sure must be somewhere, and I never found a single trace of it. What kept me awake was something closer to disbelief, the strange vertigo of realizing that 32 years of quiet devotion could be erased so completely, so efficiently, by one weekend of a daughter deciding her father's love was an embarrassing rounding error in an otherwise perfect story. Around midnight, my phone lit up one more time on the nightstand. Not a text. A voicemail, left without the phone ever ringing on my end. The kind you leave when you've worked up the nerve to talk and then lost it the second the beep sounded. I let it sit there, unheard until morning. Some silences, I've learned, are worth protecting even from yourself for a few more hours, if only to make sure the next thing you say to your own child isn't something spoken in the heat of a wound still bleeding. The bomb, as it turned out, hadn't gone off at the wedding at all. It had simply been waiting, patiently, ticking somewhere between a canceled transfer and a frozen credit card, for the exact moment my daughter's carefully constructed illusion finally ran headlong into a bill nobody but me had ever been paying, on a honeymoon nobody but me had ever funded. 2 days later, the honeymoon officially collapsed. Bennett's assistant had apparently tried to charge business-class tickets to a card that no longer existed, and when the airline politely declined every alternative Grace offered, the two of them found themselves stranded in an airport lounge, arguing in whispers loud enough that a stranger later told my sister about it before my sister even had the chance to tell me herself. They drove straight from the airport to my shop, still in their travel clothes, suitcases presumably still sitting untouched in the trunk of the Porsche they could no longer make payments on. I heard the tires on the gravel before I heard the door, that particular too-fast crunch of someone who'd spent the whole ride rehearsing a speech they knew, somewhere underneath the rehearsal, they didn't actually believe a word of. The door banged open hard enough to rattle the window glass behind the table saw. Grace stood there in yesterday's clothes, mascara already halfway down her face, like she'd started crying somewhere around the Tappan Zee and never quite managed to stop. Behind her, Bennett Sinclair, tall, exhausted, wearing the particular expression of a man who had clearly expected his life to contain far fewer surprises than it currently did. "Dad!" Her voice cracked exactly where she wanted it to crack, the way it used to when she was 9 and wanted out of a punishment. "What did you do?" I set down the plane I'd been running along a cedar board and didn't answer right away. I've learned over 68 years that silence makes people say the truth faster than questions ever do. Grace turned to Bennett, and this is the part that told me everything I needed to know about exactly how far my daughter was willing to go to protect a lie that had already collapsed. "Bennett, I told you he's been having episodes since Mom died. Confusion. He forgets things. He gets paranoid about money. This isn't him." There it was. Not an apology. Not even an excuse dressed up as an apology. A diagnosis invented on the spot, handed to a stranger as casually as a coat check ticket, designed to turn a wronged father into a confused old man, too pitiful to be believed by anyone in the room, including himself. I looked at her for a long moment, and something in my face must have made even Bennett uneasy, because he glanced between the two of us like a man realizing mid-flight that the plane he'd boarded didn't actually match the ticket he'd been sold. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I walked to the metal filing cabinet in the corner of the shop, the one that still smells faintly of the machine oil I keep stored next to it, and pulled open the second drawer. Inside was a folder I'd assembled slowly, quietly, over 2 years, the way a man assembles anything he suspects he'll eventually need, and prays every single day he never actually will. I set it on the workbench between us and pushed it toward Bennett, not toward Grace. "Confused old men," I said, "don't usually keep receipts this organized." He opened it slowly, the way you open something you already suspect is going to hurt. On top, the mortgage refinance documents on the house I'd raised Grace in, my signature at the bottom, dated 14 months earlier. Beneath that, 2 years of Porsche lease statements, auto-debited from an account with my name on it, not hers. Beneath that, wire transfer confirmations, $150,000, routed through a trust labeled Anonymous Family Benefactor, time-stamped and dated to match every single vendor invoice from their wedding, down to the florist's final balance. Bennett went pale in a way I've only seen a man go pale once or twice in my life, the particular color of someone watching an entire version of his own marriage turn out to have been fiction from the very first date. He looked up at Grace, then back down at the folder, then up again, like he was hoping the second look might change what the first one had already shown him. "You told my father your family didn't have money for the wedding," he said, quiet, controlled, the voice of a man doing math he didn't want to be doing in front of an audience. "You told him your dad was some kind of—" He stopped himself, glanced at me, and I watched him recalculate the sentence he'd been about to finish in front of the very man it had been describing. "You let everyone believe he refused to pay for anything. You let them believe he refused to even show up." "Bennett, I can explain." "You told my father he was buying your father's dignity back for him," Bennett said, and his voice finally cracked, not with sadness, with something colder and far more permanent. "My father gave a toast about it, Grace. He called your dad's absence the tragedy of addiction in front of 200 people. He told our family friends he admired you for rising above it." The shop was silent except for the ceiling fan ticking overhead and the distant hum of a compressor. Grace opened her mouth, and for the first time since she'd walked through that door, nothing came out at all. That's when the second set of tires hit the gravel. Grace, I would learn later, had texted her Aunt Colleen from the car on the drive over. Not an apology, not an explanation, a summons, framed exactly the way she'd framed everything else in her life for the last 2 years. "Come to Dad's shop right now. He's confused and saying awful things about me. I need you here." Colleen came in fast, purse still swinging off her shoulder, already mid-sentence, before the door had even finished swinging open. "Marcus, what on earth is going on? Grace called me hysterical. She said you were saying things that don't even make sense." I let her get exactly that far. Then I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out my phone, and pressed play on a voicemail I'd saved for exactly this occasion, one Colleen herself had left me almost a month before the wedding, back when I still believed silence was the kinder option for everyone involved. Grace's voice, tinny through the old recording, filled the shop from wall to wall. "Aunt Colleen, it's me. Dad said he'd rather go fishing than watch me marry into those people. I know, it's so embarrassing. I didn't want to tell you, but that's Dad for you. I'm just heartbroken, honestly." The fishing line hit exactly the way I'd known it would. Colleen's face moved through disbelief, then confusion, then something that looked for one brief second like grief for the brother she'd nearly believed a lie about for a full month. Then she turned slowly to face her niece, and I watched 60 years of family loyalty snap clean in half in front of my eyes. "You told me your father chose fishing," Colleen said very quietly, "over your wedding." Grace didn't answer. There wasn't an answer left that could have survived that sentence. What happened next I won't dress up or soften for the sake of telling a tidier story than the one that actually happened. Colleen crossed the shop floor in 3 steps and slapped her niece across the face, hard enough that the sound of it cracked louder than the table saw ever has in 30 years of running this shop. Nobody moved to stop her, not Bennett, still holding a folder that had just quietly ended his marriage before it had even properly begun. Not me, standing at a workbench I'd built with these same two hands, watching the last wall of my daughter's fairy tale come down in real time, in a room that smelled like sawdust, and for the first time in 2 years, finally smelled like the truth. Grace's hand flew to her cheek, more shock on her face than pain, as if the one relative she'd counted on to take her side automatically had just proven that even manufactured sympathy has a limit. Nobody spoke for a long moment. The compressor clicked off somewhere in the back of the shop, and in the sudden quiet, I could hear Bennett's breathing, ragged, the sound of a man recalculating an entire future in real time. He closed the folder slowly, almost gently, the way you close something out of respect rather than anger, and looked at me for the first time since he'd walked through that door. "I'm sorry," he said, and I believed him, because there was nothing in it for him to gain by saying it. I had no idea. Then he looked at Grace, and whatever tenderness had been in his voice a moment earlier was gone completely. "I need some air," he said, and walked out to the gravel lot alone, leaving his new wife standing in a woodshop with a folder full of her own lies and an aunt who could no longer look at her. The collapse, once it started, didn't slow down for anyone's convenience. Bennett moved out of their shared apartment within the week. I heard through channels I never asked for and never particularly wanted that his family's attorneys were already drafting paperwork for an annulment rather than a divorce. Fraud, they were calling it, the kind of legal language that means a marriage gets erased from the record entirely instead of simply ended, as if 2 years of careful lies had voided the whole contract from the very first signature. Vaughn Sinclair, I'm told, was the one who insisted on the word fraud specifically. A man who'd stood up in front of 200 guests and given a toast about overcoming a father's addiction does not enjoy discovering that the addiction was fiction, and the actual father had been quietly funding the very toast that humiliated him in front of his own social circle. The venue's parent company filed suit against Grace directly for the $80,000, plus late fees, plus what their lawyer generously described as reputational damages for the embarrassment of a bounced final payment on a property that regularly photographs weddings for glossy magazines. I wasn't named in the suit. I made certain of that before I ever canceled a single dollar. Every payment I'd made for 2 years had gone through that trust, under that alias, with paperwork clean enough that not a single creditor could trace a cent of it back to my name. Grace had built her fantasy on my invisibility. It turned out my invisibility was the one thing about that entire wedding that actually protected someone in the end, and that someone wasn't her. The Porsche went next. I heard about it from a neighbor 2 streets over from her new apartment, who happened to be walking her dog the morning a flatbed tow truck backed up to the leased Cayenne in broad daylight, while half the block watched from their windows, with their coffee going cold. Grace apparently stood on the curb in her robe, arguing with a tow operator who had absolutely no interest in her explanation of who she used to be married into or how much that name was supposed to still be worth. Then came the part that, I'll admit, surprised even me. How fast an entire social circle can turn its back on someone the moment that someone stops being useful to be seen with. The story didn't stay contained to one family. It moved through the exact circles Grace had spent 2 years trying to impress, the way gossip always moves fastest through the people with the least to actually lose from repeating it. Her name started appearing in whispered versions at charity galas she was no longer invited to attend. The magazine where she'd built her career as creative director, the same magazine that had spent years teaching its readers how to look wealthier than they were, quietly let her go within a month, citing, in language so careful it might as well have been drafted by the same lawyers suing her, concerns about brand alignment following recent personal matters. Every door Grace had spent 2 years polishing her way through closed one after another in almost the exact order she'd opened them. I learned later that even the smaller cruelties compounded. Her stylist, who'd dressed her for free in exchange for magazine credit, quietly stopped returning calls. The boutique hotel that had comped her a bridal shower weekend in exchange for a feature spread pulled the article before it ever ran. A woman who had spent 2 years curating the appearance of being chosen, envied, and secure discovered, in the span of about a month, that almost none of it had ever belonged to her in the first place. It had all been borrowed, some of it from me, and the rest from people who were only ever interested in lending it to a version of Grace that no longer existed the moment the wedding photos stopped being flattering. I won't pretend I felt nothing watching it happen from a distance. I felt plenty, but underneath the ache was something else, something that had been building quietly for 2 years without my fully realizing it, a kind of grim, exhausted relief that the performance was finally, unmistakably over for everyone involved, including the audience. 3 weeks after the wedding, on a night when the rain was coming down hard enough to turn my driveway into a small river, someone knocked on my front door a little after 10. I already knew who it was before I even looked through the window. The same way you know a storm is coming before the first drop actually hits the roof. Grace stood on my porch, soaked through, mascara long gone, hair plastered flat against her face, looking less like the bride who'd glided across a dance floor under a chandelier and more like the little girl who used to show up at my workbench after skinning her knee, certain her father could fix anything with a bandage and a kind word. "Dad," she said, and her voice broke apart on the single word. "Please, I have nowhere else to go." I stood on the other side of that door for a long moment, my hand actually resting on the deadbolt. And I want to be honest with you about what that moment cost me, because there's no version of this story worth telling if I pretend it was easy. Every instinct I've spent 32 years building told me to open that door, wrap a blanket around my daughter's shoulders, and tell her everything was going to be all right, the way I used to when she was small enough to believe it without question. I didn't open the door. I stood in the dark hallway of my own house, listening to my daughter cry on the other side of a door I'd built with these hands. And I let the silence answer for me, the same way it had answered every text, every voicemail, every performance she'd staged since that ballroom. After a while, I couldn't tell you exactly how long, time moves strangely when your chest feels like it's being slowly crushed by something you're doing to yourself on purpose. I heard her footsteps retreat down the porch steps, heard a car door somewhere out on the rain-slick street, and then nothing but water hitting the gutters. I sat down at my kitchen table in the dark rather than turn on a light, because I didn't especially want to see my own face in that moment, and I let myself think it through one final time, the way a man checks a knot twice before he trusts it to hold real weight. If I opened that door, if I quietly paid off the venue, if I wired her enough to start over clean somewhere far from all of this, I wouldn't be saving my daughter. I'd be doing exactly what I'd done for 2 straight years, buying her more runway to keep believing that consequences were something that happened to other people, that her father existed to absorb the cost of every choice she made, so she'd never once have to feel the actual weight of any of them. I thought about Eleanor, about the pearls still sitting wrapped in blue cloth on my dresser upstairs, about the promise I'd made her that I never got to keep. I thought about what she would have said, and I already knew, because she'd said some version of it to me years earlier, back when Grace was younger and the debts were smaller and I still had time to listen properly. Sometimes the most loving thing a father can do is refuse to be the reason his child never learns to stand on her own 2 feet. If I rescued her from this particular mud, I wasn't rescuing my daughter at all. I was simply funding one more season of a woman who had never once, in 32 years, been forced to feel the true and complete cost of a single lie she told to protect herself. I let her stay out there in the rain that night, And it is, to this day, the hardest thing I have ever chosen not to do. I never once told myself it was easy, and I never once let myself pretend it didn't cost me something I'll be paying for in quiet moments for the rest of my life. But love, real love, sometimes looks exactly like a closed door in the rain. And I had finally, after 32 years, learned the difference between protecting my daughter and protecting the lie she'd built her entire adult life on top of. One borrowed dollar and one invented story at a time. 8 months passed before I saw my daughter's face again. I heard pieces of it the way you hear about weather in another state. Second-hand, delayed, filtered through relatives who still felt the need to report back to me, even though I never once asked them to. Grace had deleted every social media account she used to curate so carefully, the same accounts that once made her life look like something out of the very magazine she'd helped design for other people to envy. She'd filed for personal bankruptcy not long after the lawsuit from the venue finally settled, the debts simply too large and too public to survive any other way. She was working nights now, waiting tables at a roadside diner 2 towns over, the kind of place with laminated menus and a bell over the door instead of a maitre d'. She'd moved into a small apartment above a hardware store, the kind of place I imagined still had radiators that clanked through the winter, the kind of place nobody photographs for a glossy magazine spread. I heard, too, that her hands had changed. Calluses, the beginning of them, the same kind I've carried on my own palms for 50 years of carpentry, the honest kind that comes from actually doing something rather than performing the idea of having done it. I didn't go looking for any of this information. It found me anyway, the way truth eventually does once a family gets small enough for the silence to carry. One gray Tuesday morning on my way back from a hardware supply run, I found myself, almost without deciding to, pulling into the gravel lot of that same roadside diner. I told myself I needed coffee. I'm 68 years old. I've learned not to argue too hard with the reasons my own body gives me for driving somewhere I've never actually been before. The bell over the door rang when I walked in, and I saw her before she saw me. Hair pulled back plain, no makeup, an apron with a coffee stain near the pocket, refilling a trucker's mug 3 booths down. When she finally turned and clocked who'd just walked through the door, she froze completely, mid-pour, coffee nearly overflowing the rim before she caught herself at the last second. Her free hand instinctively moved to cover the other one, the one with the calluses, as though she was still, even now, embarrassed by evidence of an honest day's work, the way she used to hide report cards that weren't good enough. I sat down at the counter and didn't say anything dramatic. I didn't come to deliver a speech or extract an apology or watch her squirm the way some part of me, if I'm honest, might have wanted to 8 months earlier, back when the wound was still fresh enough to want company in the pain. I simply said, "Black coffee, please." The same 3 words I could have said to any stranger behind any counter in America. She poured it with a hand that wasn't quite steady, set it in front of me, and stood there for a long moment, like she was waiting for the other shoe to drop. The mockery, the lecture, the quiet cruelty she probably felt, deep down, she'd earned every right to receive. It never came. I just wrapped my hands around the mug and let the silence sit there between us, the way it always eventually tells the truth, if you give it enough room to breathe. She came back a few minutes later, off the clock now, apron untied and folded over one arm, and set a slice of pie down on the counter that I hadn't ordered. "On the house," she said, and then, before I could respond, the word she'd apparently been carrying for 8 months finally broke loose all at once. "Dad, I'm sorry." Her voice cracked, and this time it wasn't a performance, because there was no one left in that diner worth performing for anymore. Not because I lost everything. I know that's what everyone assumes. I'm sorry because I lost you. And I did it to myself, one lie at a time, and I let you stand outside a window in a rented tuxedo because I was more afraid of what the Sinclairs thought of me than I was of what it would eventually do to my own father. I let her finish. I've learned this past year especially the value of letting a person finish an apology all the way through instead of rushing in to make it easier for them. When she was done, I reached into my jacket pocket and set an envelope on the counter between us. She stared at it like it might be a bill, or worse, a lawyer's letter, some final formal severing she'd apparently been quietly bracing for ever since the night I'd left her standing alone in the rain. "Open it," I said. Inside wasn't money. It was Eleanor's pearl necklace, still wrapped in the same soft blue cloth I'd carried it in 6 hours down to the Hamptons the night everything fell apart, alongside a note in my own handwriting, the same handwriting she used to trace with her finger on birthday cards when she was a little girl who still believed her father could fix anything. This necklace was never meant for a fake bride. It was always meant for a woman who knows how to carry her own weight. Grace read it twice. Then she cried in a way I hadn't seen since she was small enough for me to actually pick up and hold, standing behind a diner counter in a stained apron, clutching her dead mother's pearls in 2 hands that finally, after 32 years, looked like they belonged to someone who'd actually earned something worth keeping with them. At one point, an older trucker at the end of the counter called out for a refill, and Grace was up and moving before I could even offer to wait. I watched her pour his coffee, apologize for the wait, even though there hadn't really been one, and thank him for tipping on a cup of black coffee that cost less than the tip itself. It struck me, watching her, that I hadn't seen my daughter treat a stranger with that kind of plain, unhurried decency since she was in high school, back before creative directors and trust funds and men named Sinclair had convinced her that decency was a currency worth trading away for something shinier. When she came back to sit across from me, she caught me watching and gave a small, embarrassed laugh. "I actually like this job," she admitted, like she still couldn't quite believe it herself. "Nobody here wants anything from me except a fair tip and a full cup. We didn't hug and sob the way people do in the movies. That's not who we've ever been." And I wasn't about to pretend otherwise, just because the moment seemed to call for it on a screen somewhere. What we did instead was sit at that counter, together, and share a pot of cheap diner coffee during her 15-minute break, talking about nothing important: the weather, a leaking faucet in her apartment I offered to come fix, whether the diner's owner would let her take an extra shift for the holidays. Small things. Ordinary things. The kind of conversation two people can only have once they've both finally stopped performing for each other entirely. I've thought a great deal, in the months since, about what it actually cost to get the two of us to that counter. A house nearly lost to a mortgage. A marriage that never should have existed in the first place. A reputation my daughter spent 2 years polishing. Gone in the space of a single season. People sometimes have to burn down every beautiful illusion they've ever built before they can finally see the actual light underneath it. My daughter lost the crown she thought she wanted so badly. What she found instead, standing behind a diner counter with calluses on her hands and her mother's pearls finally, rightfully, resting around her neck, was the shape of an actual human being, one I recognized for the first time in years. And that, more than any check I ever wrote, more than any mortgage I ever signed, more than any wedding I was never invited to walk through the front door of, that turned out to be the most expensive wedding gift I ever gave my daughter, and the only one, in the end, that was ever actually worth the full price I paid for it. Not in dollars, but in a rainy porch, a closed door, and every single night afterward, I spent wondering if I'd done the right thing at all.